All right, hello. So welcome back to another lecture. So in this lecture, we're going to be looking at the integumentary system. All right. So our integumentary system, in general, is going to be associated with our skin. Right. So we're going to look at our skin, and we're going to look at how we can classify our skin based on different features. We'll look at various layers of the skin. We'll look at different cell types that we can find in the skin and associated with the skin. We'll also look at various accessory structures and talk about some of the relevant physiology and some of the relevant functions that the skin carries out. So when we think of the skin in general, the skin is going to be what's known as a cutaneous membrane. Okay, so we have different types of membranes in the body. We have serous membranes and we have um, uh, cutaneous membranes. We have these different types that will surround different body cavities, surround different body um, regions and areas. And in this case, cutaneous is referring to skin. So this is our skin membrane. This is the membrane that is the most superficial uh, structure, the most superficial aspect of us, right? It's what we see whenever we look at somebody from a very external, very superficial view. This is what we see, right? So we know that the skin has many different functions depending on what cell type or what thing you're specifically referring to. So it can have things like protection, right? So in very general, our skin is our first line of defense, right? So anytime you break the skin, anytime you damage the skin, you have now opened up a portal of entry for some type of microbe, some type of pathogen to enter, right? We can have our skin be involved with the regulation of our body temperature, right? And so we can have the blood vessels in the skin, they can dilate or they can constrict in an effort to release additional heat or to retain additional heat, right? We also have the skin, going back to protection, produce melanin, right? So melanin is the pigment in our skin that gives it its pigmentation, and this can help protect our skin from harmful UV radiation. Okay, we have things like production of different things in the skin. So one thing that we produce that we'll talk about later is something called vitamin D or vitamin D3, which is converted to another product called calcitriol, and this is necessary for our absorption of calcium in our gut, in our digestive system. So proper functioning of the skin to form and to synthesize calcitriol is necessary for a digestive related function of absorption of calcium. And then one other last important thing, and there's others, but last main one that we'll look at later is sensation, right? So we're able to detect and then ultimately perceive different touch and pressure and vibration and pain and temperature and all these different stimuli due to the presence of um, uh, sensory receptors that are embedded within our skin. And we'll see that some are embedded more superficially in our skin, some are embedded a little bit deeper in our skin. Okay, so when we look at our skin here, these are some of these general functions that we looked at, right? And so as we talk about these functions in more detail later on, we'll come over to an image that looks something like this, and we'll look at some of these specific cells. So you can see here we have different sensory receptors, we have blood vessels down here, we have sweat glands that can help with our regulation and maintenance of body temperature. So we'll talk about all these. We have fat down here in the hypodermis. So we'll talk about all these, and we'll see specifically how they carry out their function as part of the skin. Okay. So when looking at our skin, we're going to divide the skin, and when we say skin, we're going to mean two parts. We're going to divide it into two parts. The first one is called the epidermis. Okay. So the prefix epi. What does the prefix epi mean? The prefix epi just means on top, right, or above. Dermis, that's another layer of the skin that we're going to look at. So one layer is the epidermis. The second layer is the dermis. The epidermis, based on the prefix epi, is on top of the dermis. So it's superficial to the dermis. So when you look down at your hands, or you look down at your arms, your legs, you look in the mirror and you see the skin on your face, you're looking at the epidermis of your skin. Okay, if you could peel back, there's 4 or 5 layers of the epidermis depending on where you're talking about. If you could peel those 4 or 5 layers back, you would get down to the underlying dermal layer, or the dermis, okay? And then we'll talk about the features of the dermis. So starting off with the epidermis, we have different cell types in the epidermis. One type are going to be called keratinocytes. All right. So the ending site, that just means cell. Okay. And then keratin or keratino, this is referring to the keratin protein. All right. And we have keratin proteins, or these keratin filaments, on the superficial aspect of our epidermis, kind of sitting on top. Okay. And they provide this kind of waterproofing protective function that helps keep our skin protected, but also helps keep it hydrated. Okay. And so if you look here, you can see all of these cells. Hopefully you can see my cursor to the left here in this image. All of these cells here are keratinocytes. And then you see superficially up here, we have these keratin filaments, or these keratin protein strands. All right. Now, different areas of our skin will have more or less keratin. And in our histology lecture that we looked at, we said that the epidermis was what's called a stratified squamous epithelium. Okay, and we specifically said it was a keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. All right. So in this case, this stratified squamous epithelium is keratinized, associated with our skin. But remember, we have other stratified squamous epithelia that are not keratinized. So things like lining the esophagus, lining the inside of the mouth, lining the vagina, lining the anus, right? So all of these areas are also stratified squamous, but because they're within the body and the internal environment of the body is able to keep them wet and able to keep them moist, full of moisture, the keratin in that case is not necessary. So the skin is a keratinized stratified squamous, but remember those other areas, esophagus, inside of the mouth, so on, are non-keratinized stratified squamous. Okay, so keratinocytes are one. We'll see later when we look at the specific layers of the epidermis. These layers here, we'll divide these layers into 4 or 5 different sections. You'll note that the bottom layer of keratinocytes are kind of more round or cuboidal in shape, and then as you move up, they kind of stay round, but then they ultimately become flat and squamous. So this is where we get our squamous epithelia. Okay, they also start off dead. They start off alive, and then as they progress toward the surface, they progressively die off. And we'll look at that in just a second. Okay. All right. Second cell types that we have are called melanocytes. Melanocytes. So melanocytes are, if you look at the name, if you look at the term melanocytes, this is a melanin cell, or a melanin producing cell, hence the term melano and then the term cyte, right? So melanocytes produce a pigment called melanin, and we'll talk about it later, but we have different types of melanin. Okay, so one type is called eumelanin, EU melanin. Anytime you see the term EU associated with the word, EU means true. Okay, so this is true melanin. You could also think of something like a eukaryotic cell as a true nucleus, a cell with a true nucleus versus a prokaryotic cell. And then we have another one called pheomelanin. Okay, and so pheomelanin is the melanin that is associated with people who have more fair skin and things like red hair. Okay, so we have these different types of cells that produce these different types of melanin. Eumelanin is the kind of typical melanin that we generally think of. This is the darker pigment that's produced that gives skin a darker pigment to it. And we'll see later that it's produced down in the stratum, what's called the stratum basal, which is just this deepest epidermal layer here. And it produces melanin and packages it into these things called melanosomes. And then the melanosomes travel up into the epidermis, and then they release the melanin, and it gives the skin this pigmentation. Okay, and then this pigmentation can help absorb some of the UV radiation and help protect underlying cells from this exposure to the UV radiation. All right. Okay. So this is an extremely important principle whenever we're looking at cells in the epidermis. Okay. So we start off round, kind of cuboidal in shape, and very much alive. Okay. So the underlying cells are alive. These are our what you can think of as the stem cells, if you will, of our epidermis. This is where blood is nourishing them at the bottom from the dermis. They are undergoing mitosis, they're mitotically active, and they begin pushing their way up into a more superficial layer. But as they push their way up, they become progressively kind of flattened, they become more squamous in shape, they lose their nucleus, and then they ultimately die. Okay, so keep in mind, at the bottom, we're alive and we're round. At the top, we become more flat, more squamous, and we're dead. So that's what we can see here on this right graph here. So we start off round and alive, and as we go up, we're flat and dead. So we're starting deep here. So this is closest to the dermis, right? So this is what we'll call the stratum basal, way down here. And then as we move up more superficially, closer to the external environment, we become more flat and dead. This is what's called our stratum corneum, okay? And we'll look at this, all right? So in this epidermis, where we move up and we go from round to live to flat and dead, we have no blood vessels here. Okay, so the epidermis is what's called avascular. Okay, the term "a" in front of a word just means not, right, or without. So there's no vessels. It is without vasculature. And so this is one reason why, as these cells move up, they die, because there's no nourishment, there's no blood supply to keep them nourished, to keep them alive, and to keep them functioning. Okay. All right. So we are going to stop here with our first part, and we're going to pick up by talking about the various layers of the epidermis, and we're going to do it from deep to superficial.